Welcome, everyone. It's Angelo Robles, and welcome to At Family Office, at Family Office TV, and more of our podcast listeners on Apple and Spotify. Spotify? That would be Angelo Robles Podcast. And most of all, welcome to my members of SFO Continuity, where you're live at the moment, not just randomly per some selections that I do, and you get a chance to interact. And again, less and less of our content is going to be at least in the moment and for a 30-day window available to most. So it's going to get a little tighter and a little tighter in the next 30 days. So jump on in and join SFO Continuity. Really excited today. And yeah, there's a reason for the hat. But before all of you call me, oh, come on, kind of a carpetbagger, it's a conversation on ranch land. If you watch my interviews pretty randomly 5 or 10 times a year, I will take out the hat. I've owned it for years. I wear it regularly. Yes, in Connecticut, it's a little bit unique, but in Wyoming, when I'm there, I feel right at home. No, I purchased it before I saw Yellowstone, although I think Kevin Costner's character, the writer, who's awesome, the whole show is great. And by the way, for those of you wondering, the first state that I ever independently traveled to when I was 21 years old, outside of my tri-state area, happened to be, for a New Yorker, who would have guessed this, the great state of Wyoming. Always been into the quote-unquote cowboy culture and the lore of the American West, and actively looking at small ranch land myself. So I didn't mean to give a little bit of an overly long open, but I think it helps to provide a little bit of context. So today, ranch land investing, the untapped opportunity for family offices to preserve wealth and generate returns. Join us today as we have a very special guest in Keith Gertsen, partner at Bitterroot Capital Advisors and a seasoned ranch land owner, as we dive into one of the most overlooked yet powerful strategies for wealth preservation, which is American ranch land investing. Discover why family offices and ultra high net worth individuals are turning to this asset class, not just for its potential, which we'll talk about, for returns, but for its unique ability to safeguard against economic volatility. For the influence of shows like Yellowstone, which, yes, I think have been impactful, to the rising demand post-COVID, we'll explore the surge in interest in ranch land and effectively break down everything you need to know. I promise you, from the perspective of family offices specifically and investing, this will be the most comprehensive multi-hour conversation that you've ever had, a little bit of a mini masterclass on the value, which is deeper than just at the surface of investing specifically in American ranch land. Part of it's going to revolve around strategic property selection, leveraging underutilized assets, including water rights, mineral rights, renewable energy potential. We do have a lot in terms of to cover today. So if you're ready to learn why the heartland of America could be the future of dynastic wealth preservation, and by the way, go back and listen to my interview with Al King III just last week. I did put it up on my more public platforms. He's the co-founder of South Dakota Private Trust Company, and we intertwine family offices, holdcos, and private trust companies as being really the ultimate trio, so to speak, in dynastic wealth that could be incredibly generational. And ranch land, in my opinion, absolutely plays into that. Without further ado, let's welcome Keith Gertsen. Keith, how are you?
I'm doing great, Angelo. Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to
this. And the last time I saw Keith, and yes, he's the one looking like Mr. Conservative over there, it was in Darien, Connecticut. No, I did not have a cowboy on. It was just a couple of weeks ago. Keith, it's pretty safe to say Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, it's a little different vibe than maybe the shishi lunch and drinks we were having in Darien a couple of weeks ago.
That's right. That's right. I would say you're as likely to see a cowboy hat in Fairfield County as you are Blue Blazer in rural Montana, but there we have it. Good way to
There you go. Okay, this is one I've been looking forward to because I'm simply very interested myself. I'll be a little greedy. What are the top motivations you see for individuals, families, and even institutions wanting to own ranch land besides the obvious diversification? And I think it's a good financial asset to own, which we'll get in enough to as we progress.
Yeah, I think the investment piece of it is obviously crucial. But when people look at their sort of options in terms of where they're spending their money or making their investments, ranch and agricultural land, recreational land has become a bigger part of the mix and discussion. Increasingly so in the last decade, although it's always been a large portion of portfolios for people, wealthy families and family offices in the past. And that goes all the way back to the Rockefellers and their purchase of what is now, Teton National Park. So this is not a new thing, but one that's evolving. And I think just given, sort of the advances in technology and all the obvious advances that we've seen over the last few decades in the ability to work remote, it's created a very different dynamic. When people used to think about leaving New York City for, parts of the wild north up in the Catskills, that used to be somewhat of an exotic, sort of venture. And now you can very easily get on a plane and be in very, very rural areas in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho. I mean, you name it. The Rocky Mountain West has really become much more accessible. I think it's just in terms of answering your question specifically away from the investment piece, I speak to a lot of people that look at ranch investing as two components. One part is where am I putting my assets and what am I looking to get out of it? And part of that is, driven by a desire, to acquire land in an area where it's very remote. You've got that sort of safety and soundness of security of lots of land around you, just the peacefulness of it, but also just the opportunity to acquire and attain a legacy asset that can be handed down for many generations if that's the desire. But, aside from that, it's great access to the outdoor activities like fishing, hunting, hiking, ecotourism is becoming a bigger thing now as well. Most of my people are more into the ag part of it, but the recreational piece of it is significant, and again, an opportunity to create wildlife conservation, habitat improvement programs. I mean, the list goes on and on, but there's a smaller contingent of people that are looking into to ranches and farms really in general is, sort of ag self-sufficiency, decreasing their environmental footprint, as with respect to their carbon footprint, and that being in a sustainable environment. But, these ranches provide all of that and then some.
Indeed. And that makes it, along with farmland, but different in other ways, which we'll get into, incredibly unique, especially the value and the uniqueness of the states within the United States. So the federal system, yet independency, which is what makes our state system kind of unique around the world. And you gave a very comprehensive overview to how, although certainly in the investment end of it, which we'll talk about specifically, Montana has been very attractive, it does run deeper than that. And in the work that I do with incredibly successful people, billionaires, and the work that I've done in my masterclass in consulting on sovereign risk and disaster preparedness for quote unquote the super rich, owning rural and remote property, yet also being a part of the community and being self-sustaining are things that I think are important. And if you believe in family continuity and that we may have turmoil and challenges to come, simply it's a hedge. And I mentioned earlier that in my open, I think it's very important to understand. Keith, how has the cultural influence that I did briefly bring up before of shows like Yellowstone have driven a surge in demand? And everything is supply and demand. That probably has also driven up prices. You could argue good or bad. And I'm assuming this is even partially due to Yellowstone taking off and COVID and understanding how things could go wrong and the aspect of being in certain states and being a little bit more remote, or at least access to such, I'm assuming has driven demand somewhat through the roof for prime ranch land.
Yeah, I think again it goes back to there's two main drivers I think that are having increasing influence. on the demographic shifts and what we're seeing in the Mountain West. Obviously, COVID was the biggest factor that created a rather large influx of folks coming from the coast and more urban areas. The second, really being sort of that the Yellowstone effect, which I think people talk about more than anything. And if you tell someone you have a ranch in Montana, the first thing they ask you is, do you watch Yellowstone? I haven't watched the show, and I do think there's parts of it that Taylor Sheridan's done a great job of, and just in terms of the authenticity.
Yeah, he's great.
The ranch hands, manage the ranch, and it is very real in many respects. But it has had significant consequences on the demographic changes. And you talked about that's freedom and independence, and that very proud sort of state culture that Wyoming and Montana, Idaho, a lot of these states have. I mean, I think it's very real to the fifth or sixth generation folks that have been there for that long and take a lot of pride in that. And I think that there's pressure on that, obviously, that's creating some, mild level of while there's both an increase in value and people are feeling somewhat wealthier, there's also this negative issue of driving prices up to the point where local populations are having a hard time making it. And I think that is in of itself a whole anthropological sort of study on how things will evolve there. But the net effect, yes, from an influence standpoint, from a notoriety standpoint, the state of Montana in particular had almost 2 million increased visitors over the last couple of years. It's created the show itself, arguably, it's created about 10,000 jobs in the state, and probably north of $1 billion in overall economic impact to the state. Maybe those are some of the positives. I mean, the negatives, well, yes, it's great to have people interested in the state. It's created a lot of concentration of that migration, which demographically, again, is kind of interesting because you're seeing a lot younger generation of people moving in the sort of work age group bucket, sort of that 25 to 55 band, where the increase of transition of people moving there has been in that sort of category. And these are the people who are actually working in industries that probably have remote capacity, but it's creating a lot of urban concentration in the areas like Missoula and Bozeman, Whitefish, really the mountain western part, and in the urban areas where you're seeing a lot of concentration of people. You're not really seeing that in the eastern part of the state, central part of the state. And the same thing is true for Wyoming, where you're just seeing concentrations in a couple of those hubs. But the rural areas actually are getting more rural as the younger population continues to migrate, out, and the ranches, and some of this we'll talk about later, are getting larger, and the industrial sized ranches are taking effect, and that's having consequences as well. But no doubt about it, Yellowstone has reinstituted a whole flux of interest. But again, there have been TV shows and series over the years that have had that same effect, not just in Montana, but other states. And we've seen that over time, over the last 50 years with big production shows that have created renewed interest.
And my next question perhaps relates a little bit to where I left off in my comment and question to you 2 or 3 minutes ago, but I think it's important to drill home and understand from a strategic perspective, regardless of opinions on things like man-made climate change, coastal areas facing quote unquote rising sea levels, political instability, overcrowding, limited self-sustainability, etc. Does this make sense that effectively the central U.S., in this case, the mountain regions, Wyoming is a big state. It's the least populated state in the U.S. Does it make sense as somewhat of a safe haven?
Well, again, it goes back to sort of what you're trying to achieve, I think, as an individual. And do you have the flexibility, do you have the resources, and the ability to actually move yourself out of an urban population where maybe your job is dependent in that market, or that your industry is so focused in an urban area? But for those that either have the flexibility of moving or to a rural area and can do their job remotely, or whatever it is their line of work is, or they're independently wealthy enough that they can make that move. It's probably not one of their only properties, but it's an area where they may go, for all those reasons. I mean, I think what we've learned, very recently with Helene, the hurricane that obviously recently hit with devastating impact on Florida and up into the Carolinas, that there really isn't a climate haven per se. I mean, that's really safe. I mean, if you look at from a natural disaster standpoint, like where the safest places are, I mean, it's Anchorage, Alaska, Washington State. You'd be amazed at the number of towns in Wisconsin that have very safe, natural disaster territory. So, I do think, yeah, there's always this feeling of flight to safety into rural areas for a million reasons. Whether you want to run from, big government, or you're trying to run from, impeding neighbors, or just, all of the above. But I still think there's always been a demand for that rural sort of, domain, and really Wyoming and Montana and the others really sort of epitomize that, right? Just given the lack of density.
Indeed. And this is probably an anchor question that really sets the foundation relative to ranch land investing, what are the essential factors a buyer should consider when evaluating potential ranch property, including, and you're going to say water, water, water. I agree. Water rights, mineral rights, topography, grass quality, access. There's so many, it may even be air access. There may be so many factors. What are the core ones that come to mind that effectively will impact the price?
Well, I'd like to back up and say, when people are looking to buy a ranch, it goes down to sort of what a mission statement is. Like, what are the determining factors and reasons why you're purchasing a ranch? I think that's the first question that needs to be asked. Is that an investment? Is that, for personal use? Is it a vanity play? Like, what is it? And that's okay. Just define what it is. What's going to drive value are two different things. Now, that they may be related in a way that others like you may see the similar values and will be willing to pay, for that, right? The recreational use component being probably one of the biggest ones, where it's very difficult to put valuation on these ranches when you're stripping out one component, which is ag value, versus in addition to the recreational use value. So those are kind of the two pillars driving value. One is, I would say, is baseline, sort of what provides the basis of investment, which is easier to measure, and the other is not. But other key factors, obviously, you mentioned water. I mean, it's hard to even have that conversation without water. It's not just about water. It's the type of water that the ranch has on it or is available to it. Surface water, for example, river streams, are in most states, Texas to Wyoming, Montana, are considered state property, right? That's the property of the public, right? Versus underground water, which is considered the domain of the landowner, right? And then the ability to either dam that, make a lake out of it, stock it, those are going to drive values. An acre of water, 10 acres of a lake is worth a lot more than 10 acres of dirt. So your ability to actually either utilize what's currently there, develop it further, it's a key driver of adding value to the property, is significant. And then all the other things like topography, location, proximity to resorts, airports, really important. I think, most of the work that we do is try to find ranches that are within 1 hour at least of an airport, and it has access to, additional recreational amenities like natural forest parks, state land, public land access, like all that stuff. But then again, then it goes back to soil, rainfall totals in the area. And the list is really extensive. And then one of the last things that I think is sometimes overlooked is, and it actually comes into the equation for anybody that's in the business, is going to look at the management practices on the ranch, what the management practices were like, whether the previous owners or current owners were good stewards of the land. Did they actually take care of it, or did they extract, too much out of it? And then it goes to like what the weed issue is and what the grasses are like. So all these things are related, but they're all factors in, and there's quite a few more. But I think those are the high level ones.
Indeed. Maybe we'll do a little deeper dive because it is so important into water. So let's assume you want to have cattle, cattle could get very heavy. 70% plus of that is water. They take a lot of water, and water
Yeah.
in life comes before even grazing and grass. So
Yep.
how do you, if there's not enough water relative to what you want to accomplish, what does it look like to have an evaluation done, drilling? How much does that cost? Multiple parts of the property across how many acres? In other words, this probably gets a little more complex and expensive than most people would assume.
Yeah, I mean, geological surveys are going to be a part of that. A part of that analysis as work done on prior to purchasing the ranch, but ecological studies, environmental studies, and really looking at the quality of the water, right? So sometimes it's not just about the amount, but the quality. Sometimes the quality is not sufficient to feed wildlife and also your livestock. So the quality of the water is significant. So I look at it from the standpoint of what's the annual rainfall precipitation over the last 10 years. And ranches that have average rainfall of 10 to 15 acres or on the 10 to 15 inches on the drier side, 15 to 25, they're going to have very different dynamics in terms of what their carrying capacity is, in terms of the livestock that are on that ground. And that's going to then drive the value. So lower amounts of participation, lower cattle numbers, lower value on that ag side. Now, again, back to my other point about recreational use, it could be that the wildlife population is significant, but it's very, and somebody therefore will pay a lot more money for it because it's a more of a recreational play. But traditionally, if you don't have good water sources and you don't have good water development, you don't have good water rights in terms of the right quality of your ability to actually secure your water rights, then the wildlife, the overall ecology of the ranch is probably not that great. So those are really big factors, and it's something you should spend an enormous amount of time researching before you purchase something. Is really looking at the water, the quality of the water, and the water rate access or component.
And Keith, I think the audience would benefit if we could actually take a little bit of a step back and talk about your family lineage and the involvement in ranch land from North Dakota to mainly Montana to Wyoming. Give the audience a little bit of an understanding of your experiences.
Well, yeah, I started with an interest in ranching in the late 90s. So I'm not by any means a, fifth generation rancher. I would probably be considered, an outside poser by many in the ranching community from a traditional sense. And I'll touch on that too, because it's really important to integrate yourself well into the communities. But one of the, we were very interested in organic and really registered Angus back in the 90s, and had a very good friend of mine who got me involved with that and spurred my interest in the cattle business. And we at one point in our career decided that once we could put together enough money to purchase a ranch, something outside of the East Coast, as I grew up in Maryland and we had farmed in Maryland on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. I did a lot of hunting and was really into the outdoors, but also sort of trying to realize, is there a way to actually acquire recreational property where I could actually make some money? And we realized, sort of thinking that the best approach there would be to get into cattle. So I was in the wrong part of the world, although it was great cattle country in some respects, but the highest and best use of that land was more for grain crop and not for cattle. When I had the opportunity, we did a lot of research. We looked all over Nebraska. We looked at North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana. And I ended up purchasing a ranch in very western North Dakota, right up against the Montana border and close to Medora, which is a sort of Teddy Roosevelt's sort of stomping grounds when he was in his Rough Rider days. We acquired a ranch outside of that area, right adjacent to it, right next to the Elkhorn Ranch, which is where Teddy ran his cattle back in the day, and started acquiring, doing an assemblage there, and started an organic / registered herd of Black Angus. And so that was, in the late 90s. We did a very large assemblage there, ended up getting involved with some of the oil and gas activity, and then partly that into a ranch in outside of Red Lodge, Montana, several years later, where we still have the primary property today. And we've recently acquired another ranch in central Montana. So, over the years, same couple different entities that we've put the businesses into. There's land ownership interests and there's cattle, partnership interests that we work on. But it's been a great love of ours. My family's really enjoyed, sort of all aspects of it. My daughter, of my four children, one of my daughters actually lives in Montana now, and just loves the Western lifestyle and is very involved in the local communities there. It's becoming what I hope to be a legacy part of our family for a long time.
Give the audience an idea in terms of pricing for ranch land. Let's call it A+ ranch land in Montana. In terms of including what I would define as carrying capacity, if I want to have property where I could have 500 cattle, what am I looking at in terms of acreage, and how would that break down in terms of pricing?
Well, a simple answer would be probably 10,000 acres or more, just because it takes about, in most parts of Montana, just to be conservative. And again, it's very difficult to answer that specifically about Montana because there's so many different areas. If you look at the screenshot behind me, you can see how the mountains in the backdrop are covered in snow, which ultimately melts and starts to feed some of these creeks down here. But these hillsides get very dry, and so the massive forage on per acre is going to be less in certain areas versus others. And so you get into lowland areas where there's flood irrigation and you have a high capacity to really increase the forage value and density. I think the general rule of thumb is to use 20 acres per animal unit or cow-calf pair. So that's a mother cow with her calf. It takes 20 acres per year to feed that pair. And so for, I would say, more institutional size ranches and investing, general rule of thumb, at least from our calculus, is that you need about 300 pairs to break even. And the break even is sort of a nonsensical thing because you have to factor in what you pay for the land, what are your other costs. But looking at what just general costs, per cow calf are by most ag extension centers will tell you what that is. And you assume you had the land for free. Your break evens, generally start to get somewhere north of 300. And it used to be maybe 100 pairs, and now it's closer to 300. But to get into that sort of more institutional size ranch, which I mean is more of a, an ongoing concern that's less typical, would be at least 10,000 acres, and valuations there, can be anywhere from 8 million to 30 million, 50 million. It depends on what the recreational value is and how close it is to the ski mountain and a lot of the other things that drive value.
Given concerns that we're hearing coming out of WEF and other people and organizations relative to the impact on climate, quote unquote, of livestock, specifically cattle, how might, and a grave concern to me, but how might future regulation, now again, it's hard to imagine something coming out of Europe like WEF impacting the incredible libertarian perspective of people in Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas. But as someone who's a bit of a worrywart at growing concerns over that here in the US, is there any noise now in either the states among ranch owners that who knows what the next 20 or 30 years might hold, and might this be a concern?
Well, I mean, there's enormous amount of research and whether you want to call it interest, noise. There's a lot of science, lack of science. You want to call it science, you can. There's an enormous amount of concern about methane gas emissions, and specifically enteric methane gas, which if you look at the average cow emanates about 150 to 250 pounds of methane gas per year. Now, breaking that down into other comparisons over time, if there are 32 million cows in the United States today, with beef cattle numbers are or cow numbers are about 32 million. I mean, how many bison were roaming the planet at the time? I mean, clearly their enteric issues were different in the way that they digest their food, and the method they gave off is significant. But I think it's a concern. I would say, on the other hand, the counterbalancing argument might be food security, and food security is a real discussion as well, equally as significant. And I think there is a balance between the economic impact as well, with the millions of people that make a livelihood out of raising agricultural product as well as livestock. So there's three components there, and three different factors that are significant. But look, the world population today is 8 billion, and it's projected to be at 10 billion by 2050. The consumption of beef, I think, in the United States is something like 87 pounds a year by U.S. consumers. And if the emerging economies continue to substitute carbohydrates for proteins, and they start moving into greater economic capacity to do so, with a burgeoning middle class and growing middle class in China and India and other regions of the Asian populations, which are significant, there's going to be increased demand for beef and for livestock in general. And I think meeting that demand is going to be something that's going to be a continual. I think if you just go back to the emissions issues, there are ways to mitigate the methane gas emissions. There are genetic practices where you're changing the genetics of the cows, where they have a different ingestive process. It's going to take a long time to get that into some commercial production. That people aren't going to spend money. I mean, the traditional cattleman isn't going to put money into investing in genetics that are going to enhance, or mitigate methane production, unless there's a real economic driver. So we have to make the sort of economics of that sufficient enough or significant enough to change behaviors. Because right now, the most significant thing is making sure, that a cow is capable of producing a calf and doing so consistently over her life. That's real money. And then the dollar beef, which is the value of the actual beef itself, the marbling and all that stuff, efficiency of converting grass into protein, and doing so in a very efficient way. Those are real drivers of value and concerns. But the emissions thing is not insignificant. It's not going away, and maybe there'll be substitute, supplemental feedstocks that we can use over time. There's a lot of work being done right now on the use of seaweeds. And again, how do you get seaweed from the coast to Montana without on the counterbalancing side impacting the carbon footprint of delivering that? So there's a lot of trade-offs. Just certainly concern. And there's certainly a lot of material out there on this right now, and you can pretty much, find, volumes of it. But a lot of it is, science that's not insignificant, but also I think there are a lot of unknowns still.
Of course, completely agree. And no, in case any of you are wondering, I can't talk for you. I can only talk for myself. I am not exchanging my protein to be crickets instead of beef. It's not happening this year. It's not happening next year. If I'm still alive in 30 or 40 years, it's not happening to me then. For you, brother or sister, your call. I'm not doing it. And although the question is meant to be a little bit provocative and to think deeper than how many of you think, there are some deeper concerns with that. What happens if we have a central bank digital currency that is programmable? That means everything is done on a specific ledger that governments or one world government could track. And we're now limited to, and I'm making this up, 2 pounds of meat a person, or simply our wallet access to capital gets cut off. Again, I don't know about you, but that's not going to fly with me. I'm going to do everything possible to fight that. So it's just something to talk about. Again, you're talking to someone who did a very, very deep dive and uncovered a lot of uncomfortable things in sovereign risk and disaster preparedness. And probably to this day, it's the most common consultative relationship that I end up having with a family or family office. Uh, yes, we're starting to get some questions coming in. That's a charm of being live, especially my members ask questions, at least make a comment. Uh, I believe it's pronounced Sayara. She notes, very exciting. I'm looking at buying land now for an equine Mustang ranch for a retreat center. I think that sounds awesome. Let me know how that comes along. I would maybe like to go visit that retreat, depending on where it is. But it sounds awesome. So keep it up. Keith, for those new to ranching, which is probably the majority of our audience, and I don't know if the audience really saw this one coming. This is a little bit, at least from the next couple of minutes, of a deep dive into understanding kind of a little bit of the life cycle of cattle, raising yearlings, weight gain metrics. You mentioned a calf, you mentioned their young one, but 50-50 birth male and female, that's a lot of bulls running around.
Yes.
Are they neutered? Is that a steer? How many bulls per cows? I know I'm only going to give you 5 minutes on this. You could probably do a masterclass of 4 hours, but I think at minimal, come on, audience, you know you're interested in this. Enlighten us, Keith.
Well, yeah, it's for those that aren't familiar with it, it's not something you learn in grammar school or grade school. But
maybe in Montana you do.
Well, certainly, you're part of the 4-H, you understand it. But the typical question that I get is, how long does it take a female cow to have a calf? So it's a mammal, so it's 9 months. So it's 9 months of gestation period. You talk about,
and it's almost always just one.
It's typically one, but there's I don't know what the percentages are total, but you'll see about maybe a 3 to 4% chance of having twins, and that does happen. We have it happen every year on multiple occasions. That's not always a good thing, but I don't want to get into the details of that. But that can be a difficult situation for the mother cow, and or one of the calves. But typically it's a 9-month gestation. You talk about what it takes to actually get that whole process done. We usually use the general math of about 20 cows per bull. All of our commercial herd are covered by a bull. And then they're also, prior to that, are actually artificially inseminated. So this is a way to introduce the genetics that we want into the herd. It's a way to counterbalance certain genetic traits that may be not sufficient with the program that we're trying to run, or we're trying to introduce new traits to the herd and measure that. So typically, again, we have about we have 1 bull per 20. We artificially inseminate. The AI reception rates are typically about 60%. So you think about 40% of your mother cows are going to be open, is the terminology, are not with calf. And over a period of typically 2 to 3 months, we'll put bulls on that entire herd, and those bulls will cover that herd, and they know when the female is open, so they'll make sure that gets done. And typically we get very high reception rates when that's done effectively. And it's spread it out. You don't have to have 20 per bull. You can go to 30, and people do varying numbers just depending on economics, the types of bulls, the types of cow they train, like how far they have to travel, the size of the pastures, all that stuff. But typically when that happens, again, once we get to the actual birthing process, there are different strategies there too. We talk about calving ease bulls, the ease of which the cow has her calf. If it's takes a lot of manpower to actually get involved, and we'll have to bring them into the corrals and bring them into a calving shed, that's typically not a good situation. We don't actually like to see that. We like to see them birth naturally in the pastures. But that's from time to time, we obviously always have to look after what's going on there, and sometimes manpower is necessary. That we hope that's a small percentage, because that's actually very costly if you think about dollars and cents. But typically it's a 50-50 ratio, as you would expect. And many commercial and registered folks will keep their female calves for seed stock for their ongoing program of maintaining a mother cow herd. And oftentimes, most of the times, either some of the males are pulled out as you may keep some as bulls, and those that are not bulls would be castrated, and they would be considered steers, which would be then fed on grass or fed naturally in your program through the growing season, and then fed and finished in a feedlot and be sold for beef. So there's varying programs. Some people, that are deeply into the registered are going to keep a big percentage of both the male and female, and others will sell them, if not all, and maybe hold back 10 or 15% for replacement heifers for their female program. And so there's a constant culling involved too. When I mentioned, a cow that has difficulty with pregnancy or her, different aspects of her ability to raise that calf are deemed not acceptable or up to what the program standards are, they may be culled. And so you'll see a typical, kind of replacement of, 10 to 15% of the herd a year. And some of that will be your replacements, and some of that will be bringing in new mother cows into the process.
And in terms of a calf born, per my recollection, average about 60, 70 pounds. If it's, and again, I don't mean to be overly graphic here, but it's an adult conversation relative to cattle and as a profitable enterprise. If it were to go to slaughter, do they get up to 400 pounds, 600 pounds? And how long does that take?
Oh, higher than that. Well, typically you think about 2 pounds of gain a day. It's just as a guideline. Our calves are typically in that 80-pound range. And by the time that they wean off of the mother cow, that's typically 120 days is your weaning period, 120 to 200, just depending. So that's where your calf is still on your mother's milk. You take them off. Right now they're on their own, and many times they're sold as yearlings. They're raised strictly for fed and sold strictly for beef. And objectively, you try to get, in our area at least, we try to get about 2 pounds a day of gain. And just depending on, again, the size at birth and the sort of their growth statistics, and what types of genetics you have and the type of gain that you're going to get, that's a significant component. What types of bulls are you buying? What's they may be very expensive bulls that have high growth rates, high wean weights. Obviously we always want low birth weights so they're easy to calve, but we want really high gain. And they're very efficient at processing and repurposing the inputs, which is, what we're feeding them into pounds. Because you get paid by the pound, you don't get paid by, how much they eat. You want them to, the ideal scenario is eat less and gain more. It's quite the opposite of the way that we think about the world. But that steer ultimately is going to get finished, in that 1,000-pound range plus. So there's quite a bit of feed to go. Yep.
And Keith, when I go to a high-end steakhouse and I'm ordering a steak, is that usually a steer? Is it a cow? Like, I think I know, but why don't I let a professional answer that question?
Well, I guess it's kind of hard to know. I mean, and for the most part, yes. I mean, I would say you would expect it to be a steer, but not necessarily. And without knowing what the source is, it's pretty difficult to be able to determine that. But by and large, yes, your steers are going to be those that have the most muscle density, that are going to have the most ribeye, the most marbling, I should say. And that's what a part of the dynamics of the genetics that ranchers actually work towards, which would be the carcass value component of the genetic program, is to ensure that there's really good quality marbling, and that if you're at any good steakhouse, you're most likely eating like super prime steer.
Understood. Back a little bit to understanding the value in terms of from a financial perspective and what to do with it, kind of management. So I'm assuming with greater assemblages, with more institutional capital, and some family offices looking at it differently than perhaps even what ultra high net worth people would, they're perhaps looking at it more as a passive investment. And that may have advantages. It has disadvantages. You now have to hire an active team. How do you know the right one? Is there employment risk? How is that structured in a LLC or company? So whether you're directly doing it or passively doing it, yeah, there is a need there for real management, real cowboys, etc. That may be a little more than someone who has no experiences with this. How are they ever going to take that on?
Yeah, that's always the second question. Well, the first question is, should I do this? And the second question, what's it all entail? And how involved is it? And maybe after 5 or 6 minutes, people say, maybe I don't really want to do that. But I guess it's just like buying a professional sports team. Are you really going to jump in there and run the team? Or are you going to hire professionals around you to do that? And then there's all the, sort of ups and downs and pros and cons of, and just the natural tendencies of running a business, and all the characteristics that go along with it. There's no different than buying a ranch. A ranch really is, a business enterprise that has all of the attributes of any investment that we do, right? It's got, all the risks, concerns. There's a lot of factors that drive, valuations, price fluctuations, macro factors that drive a lot of the agricultural components to it. But it is a very involved question and answer, because it's different for each family and for each individual. And I would say that the simple answer is that there are professionals whose job it is to help you in that process. There are many professional ranchers who have made it a livelihood to run other people's ranches. Very typically, when you buy a ranch, there's a very credible, high quality operating group on the ranch when you purchase it. That's usually the case. Not always the case, but it's usually the case. And I find that the ranch brokerage community, by and large, are very knowledgeable. They know ranch operations very well, because most of them are ranchers. They know how to see the quality operator and those that maybe aren't. The more interesting dynamic is, are you purchasing the ranch from the operator who is actually the owner? And there's scenarios where you can negotiate opportunities for them to stay on the ranch, which I always advise if that's a feasible outcome for both parties. But there's just a lot of synergistic opportunity there for both parties. One, the owner, operator, and seller is extremely knowledgeable and takes all that history of information of the ranch, which is almost is really invaluable. To creating a partnership. Maybe they want to stay on the ranch and live there. You're going to need somebody to manage the property. You're going to need somebody there that knows how to operate it. And so, that's often, a path that you see happen, but not always. But very typically, if the ranch owner sells, they always have people that work for them or on their team, or parts of the community that are adding, different elements of services throughout the year for them. So there's an embedded ecology and like infrastructure there. But again, owner operator is very different than owner investor, right? So owner investor would do all the typical due diligence on hiring a management team to manage the ranch and scale it appropriately, with all the business metrics that you would use if you were buying, maybe not an apartment building, but any other operating business. Like it's real, business school work, but it's not rocket science, and it does take some business acumen though to do it effectively, and really kind of make sure that you're staying on top of it and understanding the drivers of risk and concerns there, as well as all those levers of opportunity for enjoyment, and that balance is in that other category where you're getting more out of it than it's taking out of you. And so you hear that a lot. Like, I don't want the ranch to own me. I want it to be an asset that I can own and enjoy and use And then there's, again, everyone's got their different sort of metrics. Like, I want to be really involved, or I don't want to be involved at all. I would say most investors are in that camp, that latter camp, which is I want to own it. I want to try to manage it and operate as efficiently as I can, and hold on to it as an appreciating asset, that ultimately will build value over time, as much from appreciation than cash flow.
And Keith, of course, I just can't resist with the example that you gave of the sports team analogy. To buy a top level sports team these days, boy, I think you better be worth at least a deca billion. Like, it's amazing how that has creeped up. But no question, I would be like Jerry Jones. I'd have my hands all over things. The drawback to that, and I'm not a Cowboy fan, so I have no skin in the game, is when was the last time you really went far or even won a playoff game? So maybe that's not such a good idea. Maybe you do need to have the professionals do it. I'm not sure, but if I had that kind of money and I'm buying the New York Yankees or something like that, you're damn right I'm being hands-on. Let's talk a little bit from the,
You got the hack.
the business aspect, from a simplistic to a degree foundational. Am I buying the land, the real estate, through an LLC? But then do I need to have the cattle, meaning the livestock, under a different entity? And do I then have the management company, if I'm the one doing it internally, and my employees under yet another one? So am I having multiple, somewhat cascading yet intertwined entities?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, that goes back to the question you asked, like, why are you buying the ranch and cattle? What's the purpose? But hopefully part of that analysis is determining in what type of structure am I going to own the ranch and operate it, where you obviously want to limit your liability as an individual or as a family, right? So you were going to go through typically an LLC structure. LLPs really, provide the same level of protections, but are not used as much as they have been in the past. But, and again, that's a little bit state by state as well. But typically an LLC structure, and it depends, like, whether you want to set up the land itself in one structure and have operating components around it that are where you have JV partnerships with other families or other operators. I mean, typically, if you're not in it every day and you're not running the cows yourself, you're going to have somebody running them. You might actually want to do that in partnership with a couple other people, or other ranches. There's a ton of value in that, which is a whole other topic, but it's a viable solution. So you may actually want to set up a partnership interest in that domain, with that kind of domain focus. But generally, yes. I mean, LLC, typically there's like a holdco LLC, and you can have varying LLPs or LLCs under it that are designated for different operations. So whether that's your horse training business, or it's your cattle production, or maybe your environmental, sustainable stuff that you're doing. There can be all different structures you may come up with, but it's typically what you see.
Indeed, and I don't want to make it an intense tax discussion, although we will be getting to some tax things. Even what you just said, structuring a holding company and having the entity or entities intertwined with that, you really want to get a little deep, since a lot of these on the operational perspective may not necessarily be profitable, but maybe depending on what else is in your holding company that is throwing off profits, you have something like this that has more underlying inherent and appreciation and other value, and maybe it's structured as a net operating loss. But you want to have really, really good tax advice. I do think a lot of advice is kind of relatively generic. It almost does come down to pricing, but I'm telling you, a really, really good tax professional, and I think they're relatively few and far between. I think they're kind of worth their weight in gold. A topic for another discussion.
Absolutely.
How do mineral and underground rights come into play in ranch land acquisitions? And this is a little bit unique to many states in the American West that a lot of people in other parts of our country and even maybe around the world may not be as familiar with. It gets a little complicated on mineral and underground and what's considered underground.
Yeah, and it is definitely state by state. I mean, the definition of surface minerals, so that what you own dirt wise it can be viewed differently by different states. North Dakota is going to look at gravel and scoria, which is from surface to subsurface to a certain depth, is differently as what is deemed a mineral versus Montana. Although the general terminology may be the same, the legality of it in terms of what transfers in the deed is actually what needs to be specified. Again, that's why you have to have a very good local lawyer that understands these things and can make sure that you're protected, and then when you're purchasing is what you thought you were purchasing is what you're getting. Often, and most always, if you look at a ranch, it'll say all mineral rights owned and reserved will transfer to the new buyer. Well, the question is, what do they own, and what's been reserved? And most people are pretty honest. Like, I don't really own any of the mineral rights. At least I don't know. I don't think I do, because they were passed down 4 generations ago. Most of the mineral rights in Montana and North Dakota, well, they were stripped out many, many years ago, and then they've been sold and resold to, oil production companies. So it's like, that's an asset under the ground that has its own economy, that most likely is not part of the ranch. And that's going to be a very distinct and different value, assuming you have mineral rights and minerals that are actually extractable and have any value. But that's a real thing. It certainly was a real thing in North Dakota, where we were, and it played into parts of the discussion. And unless you're going to go back and do a title search back to 1910 or 1887 or 97, and all the transactions that transpired, to see whether you actually own the mineral rights. And some people do that and find that certain something was missed, and that did happen with us. We did do one of those and found that section of land in an area was where there were minerals did actually transfer to us. They were never extracted by the previous owner. So that can happen, but that's sort of 1 in a million. I didn't do that exercise of reviewing that for that purpose, but it was a nice benefit to see that. But yeah, you really have to look at that. But the general assumption is there's really nothing there. If there's something there, the price is going to be a different price, especially in areas where there's production.
Well, this opens up a little bit of a can of worms. If I own 10,000 acres and I have a working ranch in this example, and okay, maybe I have access to 10 feet and below, maybe there's some opportunity for gravel and others that could be quote unquote monetized. I'm also, for lack of a better word, not making my property prettier. And then what happens if the oil company that now wants to do fracking, do they have complete rights without even any sort of partnership or JV with me? And again, I go back to, they may be what I deem to be de-beautifying my property. What could I do? I at least want to get paid.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, they have deeded access to and have a protected interest to get to that interest, or protected right to get to that interest. And you as a landowner have your own landowner and surface rights as well. And these are fairly well spelled out in what's allowable, what's not allowable, again, by state or by what contract and by what production a company is actually doing the exploration. So, we had this experience in North Dakota where the Bakken, we were in the southern Bakken, and as that sort of interest and demand started to really pick up, and that market started to get developed, or that region started to get developed, as we were coming into that, it became apparent to us that one of the oil companies was going to start to do seismographic testing on our ground. They had the right to go across it, look at it, but they also had to put it back to its original presentation. Any damages had to be fixed clearly, and they were very respectful, and they handled that very well. Whatever fence they removed, they put it back in. They put it back in better. They also provided an enormous amount of information about what gravel we had on the property as they were doing their seismograph testing. We found out that we had a very large reserve of gravel that I wouldn't have known about. We knew it was there in certain areas, but we didn't know the extent of it because they had gridded the entire property, looking for oil when they're doing their blasts. So it's a really good question, and it's one that I happened upon. It's just in real time about 15 years ago, I actually had a very good outcome. They paid me for access. It was quite a healthy payment. It's a per acre kind of thing, and we definitely got paid for it. And it was not insignificant. So there is definitely a value into that. Now, looking at the wells, that's an interesting question. We didn't want to have visibility into this derricks going up and down, from our homestead, and they were given the technology and fracking and their ability to do the horizontal drilling. They can pop into reserves pretty easily by just drilling into them from very far off, right? So a section being 640 acres, if they have to own all of the mineral rights on every acre in that 640. They can put a well in the corner of the property and literally drill out right under that ground for a mile. And it's 640 acres is a square mile. So the technology today is amazing. They don't have to just go where they found the oil. They can go on the other side of the hill, put it on the other side. So they were really respectful of that and put the wells in areas where we just didn't see them. And they could put the roads in where they'd come off a state road and access the rigs from the road and not have to go through the property. But that is a concern, and it was something that did concern us when we were in that region. That what happens if the oil craziness happens that happened in the 80s out here, is it going to happen again? And all the old timers and everyone I think I bought from, if they thought that was going to happen, they probably wouldn't have sold the properties. But they basically said that's never going to happen, and it did. And we were really concerned about looking at that activity. So it is a concern.
And related to my question prior on LLCs and structures and all that, we've also spoken about there's interest of people international, ex or out of the U.S., simply for a variety of reasons. The sovereign risk in the U.S., I think, is less than 99% of other countries. Lately, I'm not so sure. But there are advantages to international people, including privacy, diversity of their assets. We're not reporting, I don't believe, to their quote unquote country. We're not on their common reporting standard, is it yet? Therefore, and again, I don't want to necessarily put you in a legal and tax position, but maybe they don't want to own it outright in their name or through even a US LLC. Maybe they want to be careful with no green card and passport, then they would tie into the US tax system. I'm assuming there's varying structures, pretty basic. They could set up with an ownership unit or unit holder of the LLC in the Cayman Islands or something like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's the level of my engagement with it and experience with it. It's sort of like any asset that you own in the U.S. as a non-U.S. citizen would have to comply with the local regulations of your tax domicile. And as long as you're compliant with U.S. tax regulation, and those countries have treaties and whatever's established that's complied with. I mean, I think that's going to be your biggest component. The reality is that the state of Montana, the state of Wyoming, Idaho, North Dakota, South Dakota, those states have their own tax regulation, and you're going to be compliant with that and participating there. And whatever the pass-through entity is or structure they have set up would be set up like any other real estate holding that you would have if you purchased a building in downtown Miami or in Denver. You'd set it up in the same structure. But I'm certainly not the tax expert from that perspective, but that's typically what we see, and that would be the behavior, and that would be the general guidance would be to comply with state and local regulation, and then mirror the same type of structures that you would have for any other real estate holding.
And perhaps related to keeping a little more off the radar, private, discrete, libertarian values, at least Montana, but I believe some other mountain states where they're very private in terms of not publicly recording values and sales. You're able to keep things far more quiet, which I think overall is good. If you're looking to collect more info to make a decision, it may not be to your benefit. Talk a little bit about that. And is that only specific to Montana or many other mountain states?
Yeah, I mean, there are many non-disclosure states.
Right.
Getting the information Yeah, non-disclosure is an interesting thing. It certainly makes the real estate agent's job more difficult in positioning a property because, invariably the question is going to be, what are the comp sales? And finding comp sales can be difficult, but there are a number of resources. Most of the data is proprietary, so there are some amazing resources out there. I have a couple, and one in particular that a woman that does an enormous amount of work in Montana that I'm happy to share with anyone on this call if they want to reach out to me. She has a database of transactions that goes back, I think, 35 plus years. She spends an enormous amount of time doing a lot of due diligence, and she covers every inch of Montana and most of Wyoming. And so we generally have to rely on that type of input to do the comparison analysis when looking at comp sales. But yeah, you're not going to find it by just looking it up. Unlike Florida or a lot of other places where it's public domain information. So it does make things trickier, but by and large, people talk, and you can get a pretty good sense of what has transacted in the local areas where you're looking. And again, the thing that's sort of crazy about that is it doesn't seem to hold a whole lot of water these days because so many of these ranches are trading, for, again, recreational value use, and it's very difficult to put a value on that. It's just very difficult to measure it. You're going to get the sales data, but some of it's staggering. So that's a bit of the challenge. So if you have the numbers, it's sort of like, I'm not sure what to do with it because, a very wealthy ranch owner that owns a S&P 500 company just had to have the ranch next to him, and he spent 3x what it's probably worth or what most would pay for it. So I think you have to decode some of that in doing your research to determine, what the drivers of the pricing was and what were the motivations, because they're significant and they're varied, by sale.
And although I know we just mentioned non-disclosure, but you're a sharp guy. I don't want you to give away any proprietary information, but approximately, to your best guess estimate, if you wanted to break down Montana, Wyoming, maybe other states, your call, but maybe over a 10 or a 20-year period, potentially what has been the average price appreciation?
So Montana, if you go back prior to COVID, the average appreciation of ranch land, and this is by a couple of credible sources, is about 8% a year. So 8% a year. Now, if you look at there are about 50 purchases, sales, resales from 2021 to recent. The appreciation there alone was 17%.
Wow.
Year over year. So significant you average that into the over 30-year period. It's it's obviously much north of 10%, but I think a lot of people, when they think about ranch purchases, are assuming that ranch land is appreciating faster than inflation, typically at 2 to 3 times, at least in Montana. And I think Wyoming is slightly different in that it has components of it that are very unique and different in terms of there's large grasslands in the eastern part of the state, very different than valuations, closer to Jackson, where you're in the Green River Valley. You're going to get, much higher prices. So the averages are not something they really want to look at. It's very regional specific. And that's not dissimilar to Montana. Eastern Montana and grass ranches are going to have very different valuation metrics than the western part of the state. And then it's about sizing of the ranch. I mean, the statistics are typically, have to break it down by acreage and the size of the ranch too. I typically like to look at tracts of over 2,000 acres. But when you're looking at the larger places, 5,000 to 10,000 plus are going to be typically very different than the 400-600 acres, in areas that are highly desirable, and they're just components that were broken off by a ranch owner to raise funds, and that may be done by a multi-generational family that's trying to bring in some extra money and selling a piece of the ranch to clip a coupon, so to speak, to help them sustain their operations. So you see that a lot, and a lot of those prices are staggering. Like the whole ranch wouldn't sell for that per acre, but the 400 or 500 acres in a primo spot sells for $10,000 an acre. Or maybe the overall ranch is only two.
Well, one audience, I hope you're enjoying. I'm still recovering from a little bit of a cold, technically strep throat, but getting better. The show goes on. We probably got about 45 more minutes left. I hope you're enjoying this longer form discussion, which is really what I enjoy. I'm curious. I'm an active allocator, an investor. These are things I'm absolutely, definitely interested in. And I also want to be of value to my members. Not every topic I do is going to be a 9 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10 for everyone, including for me. But I still need to do it because it's part of what I do. But this is definitely one that I have great interest in. And I hope for many of you that are newer to my platform understand that I really do enjoy deep, long form intellectual. Sometimes they get a little biting, like some of the conversations I actually got a debate this week, me taking the side of being a direct investor, preferably with controlling interest, versus a partner in a private equity fund that's coming up live 2 p.m. Eastern on Thursday. And then I got a back-to-back on Thursday. We're going to talk about and he used to work at Bridgewater, interesting guy, Manish, could 15 public company holdings outside of your personal real estate and some cash treasuries be basically all you need? Now, in the last 10 years, the answer to that probably is yes, and you're liquid and transparent, but is it going to be that way moving forward? That may get a little combative as well. So I'm not afraid to rock the boat. I think Keith is awesome, and I agree with him on so much. There really isn't too much, and he really is the expert here for me to disagree on. But if I hear him say something that I disagree on, like he's eating crickets, then you damn well straight shoot, and I'm gonna talk up a little bit. I ain't gonna be quiet about that. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I hope you enjoy a little bit. I wouldn't say showmanship. I would actually say deep research and long-form conversations that could help you make better decisions. And I'm happy to make the right intro for my members as well. We broached a little bit about it earlier. And again, I don't want to make it a 2-hour tax discussion, but I think it's important to maybe bring up one more thing relative to the tax benefits. And that is kind of what are some of the tax benefits broadly associated with ranch ownership, depreciation on real estate, on livestock, on equipment. Again, I know we could dive in for 2 hours on this, but maybe more of a light overview to help our audience along.
Well, it's like any business where, you have deductible expenses, and that can be everything from wages to, repairs, your taxes, your cost of goods sold, so to speak. All of those are deductible, just like any business. I think where it gets interesting is in the depreciation value. So I think a lot of people don't understand that maybe the importance of the depreciation of livestock and the schedule that depreciation is on. Since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, where bonus depreciation was allowable, cattle, for instance, there's opportunity to bonus depreciate your purchase of cattle. Now, they have to be held in a long-term format. You've got short-term versus capital gains. And that goes back to like running yearlings. Yearlings, you typically bring on young cow, steers, and you run them for 4 or 5 months and you sell them. That transaction is going to transpire most likely within a year. So you're going to have short-term capital gains. But if you're running a cow-calf pair operation, that's a long-term capital gain situation once you go to sell. But you get the full benefit of depreciation, and when you sell them, you have your recapture. But you can fully depreciate your herd. So if you're buying a 500 head place and you're going to put $1 million into cows right off the bat, you've got bonus depreciation there, which is pretty substantial. So I mean, that's a big part of it. I think the depreciation piece, you can depreciate the fences, all the improvements, your water improvements, your barns and all of your infrastructure, all of that's depreciable, including the houses and all the facilities on the property. And then there's obviously fertilizer and seed and everything else. So all of that goes in. to your expense and depreciation schedule. And I think the thing that most people talk to me about is, how do I get a conservation easement, put on a place, and how can that actually help me pay for the ranch?
That's coming, Keith.
Okay, that's a big.
Actually, since you brought it up, so something like conservation easements, carbon credits, why not? You beat me by one extra question to the punch, but go for it.
Well, I
You're
mean,
on a roll, brother. I want to let you go.
that one I can't like separate those two, because they come up in every conversation, and it's sort of those of us that know people that own ranches probably have done something with an easement. Now, of course, you have to be conservationally oriented. You have to be willing to put your ranch into a program that will define it into perpetuity. That can scare people. I mean, I have friends and investor friends that will never put their ranch into an easement, simply because they don't want the government or anyone ever to come to tell them, I'm taking it back. Like, they actually have a fear that that could happen. And there's, I don't know what the percentage of reality is there. I don't believe that there's any, but anything can happen in life, politics, and taxes. But the history has shown that that's not been the case, and there's been any case law on that as well. But the conservation easement, I personally am inclined and very much aligned with conservation programs. I think they actually align very well with the management practices that we use. They oftentimes, the easement is an agricultural easement, which really is only reducing the future opportunity to do development on the property. It's more houses, it's subdividing, it's breaking it up. So the objective is to put it into a sustainable, forever agricultural entity, and you can what will drive the value of the overall easement is going to be how restrictive the easement is. What are you willing to give up? How much of it are you willing to give up? And that's going to determine how much you're going to get back in return for that future loss. Or in a way, it is a loss, and it sits on your balance sheet as a net operating loss, which you can then offset versus income. So let's just, like, simple math. If you buy a $10 million ranch and you're willing to put it into a pretty restrictive easement, meaning you're not going to break it up into pieces, you can't sell it off into pieces, you're going to get a number of, you have houses and development on the property now. Those living unit quarters, living quarters will be defined because they're there. You may say that we have 3 houses on the property today, and we'd like the ability to put 2 more on. That's going to affect your donation, but that may be important to you, and that's totally fine. And then you determine how many acres of each of those little parcels are going to be, and they get taken out of the actual easement component. They're in the easement of a building block domain, and so that's something that's negotiable. The rest of the ranch the only development of it can only be for ag purposes, and including typically being able to put agricultural buildings on the place. So if you buy a horse ranch and you want to put loafing sheds in or lean-tos, you have the right to do that. And the easement's not going to preclude you from being able to do that. So I think they give you an enormous amount of flexibility if your overall objective is to continue to run the operation in an agricultural capacity. You have your living quarters area domain set where you can continue to enjoy the benefits of that. You may have 1 or 2 other building sites on the property that you can use for future generations or for other development for family members, what have you, down the road. But generally, let's go back to that $10 million situation. Depending on what's sold and resold versus what's in an easement today, what's sold with an easement on it versus what's not, there's been no comp sales. You could see that the future value could be reduced by as much as 30 or 40%. In some instances in the past, maybe a little bit higher. But you can find that your contribution and donation could be that much. So in that $10 million scenario, you may be getting back as much as a $4 million loss. Yeah. That's a net operating loss on your balance sheet. So there's a lot to that. I personally think it's a win-win situation for those that have the means to make that purchase, but they can also contribute back. And there's all kinds of theories around why that. I think that's valuable, to the local community and being able to employ and have opportunity for the local community to continue on with their existence as partners on the ranch as operators, where you may be sitting in Los Angeles or New York or London, wherever you may be, but they're still that ag component in the community won't be subjected to all of the negatives that come along with with parcel breakups and larger developments.
And besides what we mentioned, appreciation, cattle as simply a management, net operating losses, carbon credits, easements, kind of the things so far, again, having the audience think a little deeper, there are other potential, depending on the property, quote unquote, revenue streams. If you could talk a little bit about timber, hunting and fishing rights, leasing land for renewable energy, windmills. So if you could talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, and one of the other things we're seeing too, a lot of, and those are all component. I'll talk about them. Are guest ranch services. So I know a lot of folks that have purchased large ranches and put guest ranches on them. They actually run them, as a business, and that can be a very substantial revenue stream. And I'm sure many on the call have seen some of the dude ranches, in Montana, Wyoming, and the like, that are run as dude ranches, and so they make an enormous amount of money off the guest services component. Obviously, that is a whole different aspect of operating a business that some of the call may have experience with and find this a nice marriage. But the traditional, I think owner finds revenue sources from, you mentioned it, hunting. If the property has wildlife and has an enormous diversity of wildlife, there's huge opportunity for revenue from that. There's pros and cons to that. Typically, you're hiring an outfitter. That outfitter will bring on outside people to hunt, and that can create some great conflict within the community where the locals may object to that because that property most likely is going to get shut down for outside hunting interests. And I think there's a real fine balance there where the owner operator needs to work with the local community to make sure that there's some access. Now, that's my opinion, and others have others, but I think that's really important because that's creating a lot of friction in the Mountain West right now with outside landowners locking up these properties. But there's other sources of revenue would be like running other operating businesses if you're in cattle, like running and hiring somebody to train horses and sell horses that are trained either for ranch work or for showing or for competitive reasons. That's a rather significant opportunity. Again, running another business, maybe another LLP that gets set up. But short of that, there really aren't an enormous other. I don't think there's any other big driver of cash flow. There is some opportunity to do wind farms, and that may be an area of development, or you'll see windmill farms on some of the properties that are very far from where we are, and that you may or may not be in an area where that's something that you can develop, but that would be a significant component of revenue. I personally wouldn't want to look at them or have them on my ranch, but again, the revenue could be so great that may be a purpose.
Indeed. And I see there our live audience, because we did open this up a little more, is among the larger that we ever had. Keith, you're an incredible guest. People love you. What can I say? And I'm never not surprised in my travels relatively recently to Europe, and even seeing a little bit today, how internationally, maybe more so than most Americans, there's a fascination a little bit with the Americana, the American West, cowboy culture, libertarianism, property rights. And this seems to be of a little extra interest to those internationally. And I do respect that. And I concur. I wish many more Americans would have a little bit of that same love affair, for lack of a better word. A question kind of indirectly relates a little bit to that. How does, because the US is unique with a federal and a state system, how does state governance, like including, if I remember correctly, in the Dakotas, both of them have no lockdown during COVID, land management, regulatory issues. How is that impactful relative to choosing among the states that you may want to own ranch land on, looking at simply government guidelines, how do they handle certain stresses, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, that's a widely politicized question and something that, I think does drive, frankly, a lot of decisions on where people are putting their money. Um, I think there's, I of the clients that I've dealt with over the years and friends and investors and local families that I've gotten to know over the years, almost all of them embrace an individualism sort of mantra, and have that ethos that they think is, and I agree, is very well captured within the states that you mentioned. So I think that is a driving factor for a lot of people. I think if you look at the political dynamics and shifts in the states, it's not immaterial. It's not, it's not holistically the case. I mean, if you look at the urban areas, I think of Austin, Texas, and Texas as being sort of the blueberry in the tomato soup. There are, varying political views, and most of the people that move to these states have similar desires to and appreciation for the outdoors and what all of these these great states bring, what with respect to that type of dimension. But yeah, make no mistake. I think when you look at investing in a jurisdiction, much like again what you would if you were just determining to put a commercial real estate development project in one jurisdiction versus the other, and that can be either in the United States or any other country outside of the United States, and then the intricacies and the conflict that goes with zoning, regulation, and all that's related. Yeah, I think people are looking to find areas to invest where that's not as strict and stringent. And yeah, there's no doubt about it. That let's look very clear, like the state representatives in most of the Mountain West states, including North Dakota and South Dakota, are very much interested in protecting states' rights issues and individual property rights issues, very, very near and dear and core to their hearts. And that is an ethos of their societies. And that's something that, whether you like that or not, that is what you're getting if you're coming there. And I think it's important to know that and recognize that. I think people do know that and recognize that. And that's why you're seeing, the investments that are being made from people from all over the world in these areas, because they do find the safety and security of that type of government program and ethos to be a key component of their decision making. So yeah, I'm very proud to say that that's the case in Montana, and I know it is in all the states I just mentioned. And I think you can listen to any of the state representatives that represent the populations and the constituents there, and I think the vast majority feels like right up there with God and religion. It's property rights and individual rights.
Indeed. And I'm going to read off a question from Eric. And Eric, by the way, I see it's been haven't seen you in years. I hope all is doing well. And does remind me, because he's active in the world of Web3 and crypto, more specifically to Wyoming, the true cowboy state, Texas, I might add. It's Wyoming. It's not Texas. But I love Texas. But I'm just saying, Wyoming is the real deal. I'm going to hear a lot of flack on that one. Texas members, come on, still join. I still love you. Wyoming also is incredibly quote unquote crypto friendly, very creative. The first state with really an LLC. When it comes to private trust companies, you could have regulated or unregulated. It's very big on personal property rights. It has no state tax, and it has a governor that's very fluid in the world of crypto, Web3. They have DAOs. Now, again, I know most of you aren't into crypto. I'm just saying, It's a big part of the libertarian mindset. And Wyoming, like they were with LLCs, is way, way ahead of the curve. But yes, Eric, let's go. But Eric's specific question, does any of this land have consistent running streams running through it for hydro capacity? Maybe in your property, or broadly what you're looking at, mainly in Montana, Keith, how common is a stream? I think you might have hinted at it with the snow caps melting, but how long does that last? And could it be used for hydropower, even if that is a little bit ugly sometimes too?
Yeah, that's a good question, Eric. I really don't think that again, back to the earlier statement that I made, is that surface water is really the domain of the state. So it's owned by, it's owned by the population of the state, and it's regulated as such. So it's very limited in what you can do, how you can utilize that. Again, the water that's running down, from the Beartooth Mountains there, that during the spring, as it starts to melt, and it feeds the irrigation ditches. There are ditch rights, and there are, ditch companies that set up and down all of the land owning, and you can actually see a ditch right behind my head. It's kind of running down the side of that hill. That's an irrigation ditch, and we have to actually pay and maintain the rights to that ditch, maintain our shares of that ditch, and we have the right to access a certain number of shares. But anything that's running over the surface, including larger rivers, would be the domain of the state, and would not be something that, at least that I'm aware of, that you can use for hydropower. I think that would be that'd be really tricky. And then the environmental component of that, with respect to the impacts on the local fish population, et cetera, would be astronomical. So I don't think that one would be a viable, path forward in any of the states mentioned.
And perhaps a question I should have asked much earlier, but building up a little bit of momentum to it. Okay, I'm sold. I want to at least explore. I have my mission for it, but how do I know what properties to buy? Are there certain agents? Are there people like yourself that could act as a consultant? I'm assuming coming in as an outsider, you are sometimes, with no offense, going to get a little quote unquote shut out. Therefore, dealing with someone who has a little bit of the lay in the land, knows a little bit of the political situation. I do have to give just a little shout out, because when he saw I was having this session, and I haven't seen him in years, but there is, I believe they're based in Montana, a little bit of a shout out to Jim at Hall and Hall. Jim, I haven't seen you in years. I do remember the good old Family Office Association days. You gave some wonderful presentations on families buying ranch land. Probably 2015 or 16. Boy, did you end up being right, because Montana ranch land, as Keith highlighted, in the last 8 years, especially since COVID, has really taken off. But what would you recommend as a little bit of an agent or deal sourcing, as I would call it, as an investor among ranch land? Because a lot of it is also going to be, you'll know better than me, off the grid.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, it goes back to the professionals, the embedded traditional professionals that are in the markets. I do think they're a great resource. Again, most of them are operators as well, and they do know the land, and they know the families that own the land, and they know what may be coming and going, or could be coming down the pipe. There could be opportunities for assemblages. Jim and his group at Hall and Hall, and there are a number of others that do a great job with that. There are opportunities. At Bitterroot Capital, we don't specifically advise on real estate. It just so happens that I have some interest in that, and have become a resource for clients and people that we speak to. But there are a number of different avenues there. But the traditional one would be obviously the real estate agents. Now, finding ranches that are for sale or might be for sale, there are, depending on how much legwork you want to do and how well you're dialed into a community, can have some effect. But for probably most people on this call, that's an unrealistic situation until they're firmly embedded, in the communities, and have to be active, frankly, because if they're not active and they're not a welcome addition to the community, there's very unlikely that anyone would share much. So I think again it goes back to being a very good steward of the land and being very much integrated into the community, and then once that happens, oftentimes as a neighbor you'll find properties that are for sale. But we do hear from a number of folks that may be going through trusted estate planning situation. Look, if if the Jobs Act exemption is pulled back, I mean that's a huge issue right now for not most Americans, specifically a lot of ranchers and farmers all over the country. That if that exemption amount goes back to 5 million, I mean that puts a lot of families in a lot of very difficult situations. I mean certainly one wouldn't want to use that as as an avenue for finding opportunity, but the reality is those discussions, which are the right discussions to have. How do we protect these assets? What types of trusts should we be thinking about if we want to can have this ranch maintain itself as a multi-generational ranch? What are the economic inputs from that? What are the family members' interests and the ability to kind of, or willingness to kind of keep this thing going? There are times when those discussions happen and the family as a unit or as a corporation decides that it's best to sell. And oftentimes that first discussion is with the trusted estate attorney. The second discussion is probably with the neighbor. And then the third is probably with, a real estate agent or broker that they know or trust or somebody's recommended to them. But, if there are parties of interest that are, that you're interested in looking for something, and I find properties from time to time that people just know that, we might be interested or looking to expand, that will call you. So it's just being in the network, but the traditional network is the one that most people go with.
This goes back to kind of some themes of some of my questions earlier and the uniqueness of state rights and all that. I believe, as I was told, that 97% of Nebraska land is privately held. When I think of Wyoming, they have massive parks in Yellowstone, part of that in Montana. They also have Glacier National Park. In other words, is it a huge advantage to Nebraska and select other states that the vast majority of the land is not going to have, for lack of a better word, the feds having really big input in?
I mean, there's again, I think it's not a discussion that I've had too many times with folks. I think the bigger issue is access when it comes to having land that you own as deeded land that's integrated with state or federal land, and access rights are crucial and a big part of, I think, what determines someone's interest in a property in Wyoming in particular, and Montana as well, where that becomes a big issue. The checkerboarding of deeded land intermixed amongst state or federal land is not insignificant. I think that's a big topic. There's obviously benefits to it. You are purchasing deeded land and you have the access or a lease to adjacent property that gives you the opportunity to increase your overall carrying capacity and ranch operation. But it also has its costs, in that you have a government entity that owns it and has the right to control it and monitor it. I think there's been a lot of harmony in that domain, and there have been disharmonious instances in the past. We're all aware of the Freemen and what happened in certain part of Montana years back, and in other parts of the country. So yeah, there may be people that say, I want to be in a state where it's all deeded land, and I want to deal with the state and the public stuff that's close to me or has any proximity. I happen to think that there's a right and wrong to that in a way. Or just a matter of opinion, but the pure economics of having the ability to scale your operation with purchasing less deeded and with the access to lease, with the adjacent property that sort of comes with the lease agreement, gives you an opportunity to kind of scale the operation and increase your overall income.
Interesting. And we're down to our last couple of questions, audience. I hope you're enjoying it. Long form discussion on ranch land cattle and a lot of things around that. Again, those of you live, I have a very active and busy week this week, effectively a debate, me taking the direct investing side in privates, and a good dude, although, of course, I'm going to crush him, who's going to talk as a partner in a private equity fund. And my other guest, former Bridgewater, his name is Manish, and what he's talking about is, are 15 stocks all you need? So my members should have gotten the invites already. I'll open up a couple of guest spots on that. Reach out to me. You might have got some pre-selected relative to join, and nothing beats participating live. So I highly encourage that. And this is one of our larger, because I did open it up a little bit more openly, because it's a unique discussion that not many of you are as familiar with. And I thought you'd find it engaging, especially more than just a superficial 20 or 25-minute discussion. If you'd like to learn more, because it is a newer audience today, about me, I've been in the community, family office community, for decades. I take pride in the work that I put into it, my travels around the world. Sometimes I'm right, sometimes I'm wrong. I am never lacking for opinion, I guess you could say, and anything relative to the family office world. To me, the best is practice management and best practices, creation of, structuring offshore, disaster preparation, hedging risk, and really anything around geopolitical, especially in my more public conversations. Geopolitics, economics, and investing are things that I'm very well connected. I do a lot of deep dives in. I'm not afraid to, let's go with ask, quote unquote, the tough question, and would certainly like you all, if you're qualified, to join and be a part of it. Go to angelorobles.com. You'll see the tab for membership and jump in. If not for you, it's all good. I do a fair amount that I give away to the public. I hope you enjoyed it. But if you really want the private insight, the interactivity, the direct connections, including the face-to-face, you got to go to angelorobles.com and very simply just join. Final couple of questions, Keith. What strategies can, I guess, family offices use to capitalize on larger scale assemblages, kind of rolling up, I guess you could say, ranch land? And some of it may be JVing or partnering in varying aspects with other either families or existing ranch land owners.
Yeah, and again, back to with the regional purposes and desires of the type of structure, from simple outright ownership and leasing the land to a local operator where you're pretty much hands off. You're just land banking, the purchasing land, and you're letting others lease it from you, and you're taking your return and hoping for appreciation. And then there's the sort of scale opportunities if you want to be a little bit more involved and partner with other families that are like-minded, that you trust, and you're willing to engage in what is ostensibly a PE 10 plus 2 minimum kind of investment potentially. And it's not to say that you couldn't flip a property in a couple of years and that for significant appreciation, because that's happened, and there's quite a few of those examples around. But I think it really depends on the type of individual you're partnering with. I do highly recommend carving out economic structures for partnership interests of local producers that you're working with to create economic incentive for them to stay with the program and help you develop and integrate a very good practice and operation of the ranch. I mean, that's a fairly typical structure. The concept of assemblage and bringing in, buying more land and adding to your property is a strategy. And obviously the brokers will tell you that, when you're looking, that if there's a property for sale, if you're trying to accumulate X number of acres, the likelihood of one of the neighbors selling is very high. Therefore, go in and secure the first property, and we'll try to negotiate something with the neighbor, down the road. I did that in North Dakota. I bought a number of different parcels over the course of 7 years, and did probably 18 transactions. And so that's very likely to happen. Once you're there, you can start to do that. I mean, bringing in partners is just like any other partnership situation. It's like, who are they and what are they going to bring to the table, and what are you going to bring to the table for them? And that's as much an economic discussion as it is anything else. But I know there are a number of families that I'm aware of that have partnered on some pretty big places. Not so much in Montana, but in other states, and I've seen partnership structures like that. And then there's the concept of like private capital investing, where you go into an investment vehicle and you participate with other families in an investment in a pooled vehicle where you're sharing the economic benefit and the use throughout the ownership cycle, and you have the ability to kind of replace those people in the LP structure. So it could be a GP runs it, and you have an LP interest in a property, and those are becoming more prevalent. I don't know what the level of demand has been over the last couple of years, but you can see that as a potential vehicle as well.
Indeed. What role, we probably hinted at it a little earlier, but what role does water improvement programs and government grants play into enhancing ranch property value? Could these be tapped into? Does it vary in federal and state utilization for recreational and perhaps, I guess, wildlife conservation as well?
Yeah, I mean, there are programs involved. There are federal programs involved that are available to ranchers. I think for the people on this call, they would meet a minimum or a maximum income threshold that would preclude them from participating in those programs. They're really designed for rancher operators that don't have that income, but really need the improvements on the property to increase the value of the water, what it provides to enhancing the ranch operation in terms of better and more dispersed use of your pastures, cross fencing, just greater utilization and better optimization of ranch management practices that always require water improvement and fencing. That could be wells, irrigation related activities that are generated from subsurface water, as well as stock dams and the like. So there are programs out there, yes, federal, again, more for the actual operators, and for the investors. Most of that's going to come through their own writing the check to put in the programs in, but they're oftentimes as valuable, and oftentimes a lot easier to get done, because you're essentially doing it on your own and you're not relying on a government program or EQIP program from the government. But they're there for a reason. They're wonderful projects if you can get them, and most ranchers do take advantage of those. And those are government paid for the most part, have a cost share component to them, where the government would subsidize, as much as 80% in some instances for first-time ranchers, and it drops down for different operators. But I think water obviously started off the conversation. Water is pretty much everything on a ranch. So if you can develop it, whether that's with wells or other improvements, you do it to the extent that you are willing to forego that cost, because it's not cheap drilling a well, as we know, and then running pipeline is pretty expensive these days. So it all adds up. But longer term, it not only does it just increase the dollars in your pocket from your ability to run a more efficient ranch with again, enhanced ranching management practices in terms of your grazing strategies, but in livestock overall. But you're going to improve the ecology of the overall ranch. You're going to see improvements from wildlife and everything else. So it's something they always recommend doing. It's just it usually comes down to dollars and cents, how much of it you're willing to do. But if you can, it's always something that's encouraged.
Of course, I might be down to my final question. This is a little bit of a final call. If those of you that are live wanted to type in and send in a question, you may have question, other livestock other than cattle, a question I haven't thought of, to some degree running out of time. So some things I'm going to leave on the cutting room floor as we're starting to broach on getting a little closer to 2 hours. But final chance to do so now if you're a live participant. Maybe at least for me, a final question, and kind of maybe putting a little bit of a bow on things in terms of legacy planning, families ensuring that the ranch properties remain valuable assets, potentially generationally, continuity within the family for a variety of perspectives, including hedges against, as we discussed, economic and I could argue environmental uncertainty moving forward. What didn't we cover, or how would you put a ending on our conversation to conclude with our audience?
I think it's a really good question. And with respect to legacy ranches, in ensuring that your interests as the owner, purchaser, and your just, sort of what your objectives were in terms of ensuring that makes it to the next generation is a question that comes up oftentimes. Sadly, I would say that of all the years of being a private banker, and in, sort of the advisory businesses, 90% of the time when, the patriarch or matriarch passes, the ranch is sold. I mean, that's been my own personal experience. I don't know if that reflects the broader experience, but it sadly, that is the case. There are some that are very thoughtful about, and there was a lot of reasons for that, right? Mostly because the ranches appreciate some family members don't have an interest in it. Others do. They can't come to consensus. The only thing they can do is sell. But there are some that are very thoughtful about and forward thinking about maintaining, ensuring that there's a maintenance program in place that is really going to be sustained, not just by the cash flow from the ranch, but will set up a trust that has income generating investments in it that will provide the cash flow necessary and then some to maintain the ranch for as long as family members, descendants are alive. So I think that is a structure that I'm seeing more of, and I think it's a great thing. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that the next gen is not going to move on and dispose of the operation, but wouldn't be put in a position to sell it because the cash flow was such a drain, because the trust was set up in such a way that there's income being generated in the other assets to sustain its viability. So I would say that's something that's nice to see. I'm happy to see that that's happening more and more, and structure that I think makes a lot of sense and something I've been involved with in a couple of different instances.
Does bring up an interesting thought in that depending on trust, variety of structures, in perpetuity, how it's structured, how is it maybe settled in, marital status, whether single or simply unmarried, there may also be an estate tax issue, depending on heirs too. And now that ranch values have gotten monstrous, and there's probably going to be an adaptation to the exemption in the U.S., which I believe is next year, or is it the year after? And these are also an issue with private equity and other illiquid assets, which goes to show there is some value with having liquidity, having a game plan, having proper estate planning, even life insurance structured properly to provide liquidity when actually it's kind of most needed. So definitely things to consider. I've done some very intriguing estate planning discussions. It's been a couple of months. McDermott, Will, and Emery was on, I think it was late last year. So it's been probably more than a couple of months, probably due to tackle that subject, at least for my members, sooner rather than later. A couple of members just noted coming on late, no worries. I will ask your question in a second, but there'll be an opportunity we'll do a production value of it and have it ready in 2 days. But nothing quite beats being live. But for my members, I also make specific introductions to my guest when you want it. So simply just let me know, and I'm happy to make what I hope is a favorable introduction from my part, and not where you get, oh God, Angelo's referring you. Now I'm really going to give it to you. No, of course, you get special treatment when it's an introduction coming from me. At least I'd like to believe so. What might be the final question one of our participants asked? Keith, any opinion on friendly estates to harvest timber? If specifically, if planted as tree plantation. Let me maybe add to that a little bit. I believe certain states, I would like to hope not the mountain states, but certain states may actually have guidelines on the ability to, mow down trees on your own property. There may be little nuances. So I think that's an interesting question. And Keith, it's a little nuanced, but is that something you're familiar with?
Not really. I just only have advising families that have those types of interests in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and to a certain lesser extent in West Virginia. And so that's a very different topic. It's outside of my personal domain, but that is a significant investment paradigm, and one that you oftentimes see pensions and endowments allocating to very heavily, as we know. And that's been a pretty volatile market too, obviously driven by the commodity component to it. I think there are aspects to it that are similar to agricultural land, in that it's still an operating entity, and it has some of the benefits of operating that as an ag business, but it's really way outside of my domain of focus. And I do have enough information on that, just again having been through it with a few families. But the concluding point is that none of those properties are still owned, and they were that money was repurposed into ranch land. So that was my involvement. I don't know, maybe I was biased, and that's where it ended up, but I think that was probably a pretty good trade.
And Keith, I'm going to kick it over to you for those that would like to learn more and reach out. I will add, just making it a little personal, Keith is a great guy. He was introduced to me relatively recently by a mutual friend and acquaintance. He's been nothing but cordial, incredibly intellectual and valuable about what I'm absolutely interested in as an asset class. He also has deep experiences with a pretty incredible legit, real multifamily office that is incredible that he's with now, that I would highly encourage and recommend to learn more about, and has a significant background in ultra high net worth and family offices, having been a little bit in my backyard in Greater New Canaan and Greenwich, Connecticut, with his work at Citi. So he's very fluid, has deep connections, knows a lot of things, more than just ranch land, although I think that's going to be special and a bit unique. But enough about my infomercial, Keith. If you don't mind, if you could share how people could learn more and reach out to you.
Sure. Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate always the opportunity to get our message out. It's Bitterroot Capital, which Angelo said is a multifamily office. It's really virtual family office, and we currently have about 16 families. Firm's been around since the late 90s, founded by a good friend and partner now, Andrew Martzloff, and another good friend of mine, Carl Gardner, who I actually knew from Connecticut, that moved out to Montana years ago. And so I've known these guys for a long time, and I've watched their work, and they built a firm that I have a lot of respect for, and I'm just blessed and honored to be a part of the group and really enjoying it. And it's been a nice change of pace from the things I've done in the past, but they've had a lot of different experiences. This has been one where I can really sort of marry all of my background as a trader for a long time at Deutsche Bank, and hedge fund person at a couple different shops, including Viking there in Greenwich, and my years at Alliance Bernstein. So I've sort of been most of my career in finance, and all aspects of investment management, mostly on the institutional side for the first half, and then working with families for the last 11 years, both as a regional head at Citibank and the private bank, really focused on institutional family offices, kind of bringing more of my institutional background to individuals, as we call them. And I can do that now at Bitterroot with a very flexible platform and a great group that's built a wonderful business. And the benefit is that it's based in Montana, which all stars lined up there for me, and I've really been enjoying it. And I'm also based in South Florida, just given the focus of family offices down here. So we're trying to cover the country a little bit.
Of course. And Keith, and what I would recommend, go on LinkedIn Keith Gertsen, Gertsen. Have a chance to follow, to introduce yourself. If applicable, send a direct message. For those that, again, want to be respectful of Keith's time, but may want to reach out, one, especially for my members, I'm happy to make a favorable introduction. And even for some of you that aren't, if I like you enough and you're respectful, and I think it's going to be valuable in Keith's time, I'm happy to occasionally do so as well. If you wanted, did you want to share an email where people can reach out to you more broadly, Keith?
Sure. It's simple, Keith at bitterrootcapital.com. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody that has any interest in this conversation or any other. I'd love to talk to you about my experiences, and if you're serious of looking into this, would be happy to engage. It's a passion of mine. I love talking about it. I still feel like I know very little relative to what I could learn, but I'm still on the journey. Would love to share that with you, and absolutely feel free to reach out.
And a little bit of a closing comment. I'm really fascinated by ranch land. Keith is incredibly knowledgeable, a great gentleman. I think this is a very exciting time. I will be motivating my members to desire to learn more when I make my travels around the world. Again, bringing my cowboy hat, and don't think I don't. When I went to Austria and Central Europe a couple of months ago, without even having a case for my cowboy hat, having to wear it like 7-8 hours on the plane, take it off, put it in my lap. It wasn't the most comfortable. Safe to say there's not too many people running around Central Europe with a 10-gallon black Stetson cowboy hat. Yes, it got a little bit of attention. Not to say that I'm not someone who doesn't like a little bit of showtime. I hear you. Keith, I never knew. Like, I always thought he was awesome, by the way, meaning Chuck Norris. I never knew how synonymous internationally. There were some people from Asia that were there at like a family office thing that I went to and said, Chuck Norris, Chuck Norris. I'm like, well, thank you. I'm not Chuck Norris. He's way more famous, way wealthier, better looking than me. He's amazing at his age. I do love Chuck Norris. I'm a huge fan. So, hey, if some people mistake me for, I hope, a younger, slightly version of Chuck Norris, it's all good. But next time I go back to Europe.
Now you say it. I mean, I'm kind of seeing it,
I think it's the beard, like the beard, like the beard makes people imagine a lot of things.
Down in New York, the singing cowboy, maybe the physique, but
I may have to take that role if he's gone out of Times Square.
I think you should. He's gone. You need to.
Like I may have to work out a little bit more, but I am in pretty good shape actually. Maybe that could really supplement my income from what I do, and I could invest it in ranch land. So I could definitely be down for that. I could definitely see that. So a little bit of a final comment besides this is all awesome. Do understand this is the perspective of me and Keith. You need to do your own diligence. You need to make your own decisions. You're hearing this at a time when we're both relatively positive, short and long term relative to ranch land. Maybe you watch this in a year or 5 years and things are different. Maybe you have different risk tolerances, liquidity needs. At the end of the day, you need to think for yourself, make your own decisions, and understand, especially if it's as an investment and not maybe a family legacy for 100 years of owning. When you invest, you could lose money. So do understand that there's risk associated with that and that you need to make your own decisions. Again, I know we have many new people on today. I hope you enjoyed it. You could follow me on LinkedIn. I have 2 active YouTube platforms, at Family Office and at Family Office TV. But they're going to be further and further delayed from anything being modern, really beginning this week, as I'm really focusing in on the value added to my members, being in the moment, active participants, also the 30 plus in-person events that I do, and a lot of the written and other proprietary content that I really only and exclusively provide to them. There also is investment specific conversations once or twice a month that is exclusive for them and never makes it into my public platforms. And some of those, mainly on AI, have done incredibly well as some private investments, really only even in, under the last year. So go to angelorobles.com and learn more. But if you just want to follow me on LinkedIn, on YouTube, at Family Office, at Family Office TV, and Apple and Spotify, and even Rumble, hey, it's better than nothing. I look forward to it. Have a chance to reach out. I hope you're enjoying the content. It was really a pleasure to have Keith on. Again, those of you that are live, it'll be an active live week for me this week. Next week, I'm actually doing 2 intimate in-person programs for my members, a private breakfast, and then a little bit more of a open luncheon. We'll have 2 or 3 guests to that. You remember Johnny, who I had on from Fun Geyers about gold and storing it in the mountains of Switzerland? Well, he's coming to New York, and I'm going to host him, technically co-host him, at the Peninsula. So those of you that are around New York as a real, hopefully, member, or at least a real family office that I will recruit you into be a member, we may have opportunity for a couple of more slots. Again, that's October 10th. And he is awesome. And I'm a huge fan of what they're doing as well. And just his insight and macro perspectives and economic uncertainty relative to his conversation about gold. And I did make that more public on my platforms. You could go and watch that. So I'm busy. All is great. I hope you're enjoying it. Have a chance to reach out to me. Go to angelorobles.com to learn more. And again, Keith, I greatly appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you. I'll be more and more active in South Florida come the winter. So maybe a drink at the Breakers, the Colony, any one of the wonderful locations there. I may have to bring the cowboy hat. I'll be the only one. But again, maybe sometimes I like some attention.
Bring it on. I think that'll be interesting. I'd like to sit back maybe at the table next to you.
Couldn't be said any better. My friend, great to see you. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
As well. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.